Kidou Soukou Dion. This was actually released in North America on the Super Nintendo as Imperium, but it's important that I specify this is the Japanese version. There were a few changes depending on which region the game came out in. Not huge game-breaking differences, but enough to make them kind of completely different experiences on a smaller scale. For example, there are a couple enemy placements that are different if I recall, and one of the weapons is completely different. In North America you get like a wide shot, in Japan you get a homing shot, and I think that's like the most useful weapon in the game, so take that for a grain of salt. Weirdly enough, they also changed some of the background art between versions, and if I'm just being honest, the Japanese version is just better than the North American version. It just feels a lot more polished. The story is rather weird. In the far-flung future of 2027, after a millennium of human extinction, suddenly robots are being turned into slaves by other robots, so they build up an insurrection and build an awesome suit of power armor that can only be wielded by a human. But we went extinct a millennium ago, and that doesn't actually fit with human history. Look, it's a shmup, don't question it. Plot is not the important thing. The important thing is to go shoot all the things. The gameplay itself to Imperium is fairly standard for a vertical scrolling shmup, although it does have a few neat little bells and whistles. First and foremost, it has a speed modification button. With 4 different speeds you can select to find the one that suits your needs the best, as well as a series of 4 weapons which you can switch between once you earn them. You have to earn them in the first stage, which leads me nicely to what is probably the most interesting system this game has, and that is that it tries to give purpose to a scoring system. Normally in shmups you gain score mostly for bragging rights, to top a leaderboard, and to give the game a sense of replayability outside of beating the game past a crushingly hard difficulty, because this is where arcade games came from. This game decides, let's throw out the whole score concept and instead call it experience, and we'll make it like an RPG leveling system. Every enemy you kill builds up experience, and you can see at the top that there is a certain amount of EXP you need to gain before you hit your next level. Once you hit that level, boom, you heal, which is great. You also level up one of your weapons, or if you're playing the first level, gain your weapons, which means not only do you get a better fighting chance the more you level because you've got a heal, you're also getting better weapons, which level up to 3 levels, and they get significantly better as time goes on, which is really good. The 4 different weapons you get in this game are a standard shot that, when it levels up, spreads out a little bit more. You start with 2 shots to 4 to 6 or so. It gets a little bit bigger, and the weapon itself is overall very, very useful. There is a very powerful laser, your standard sort of laser weapon. It's a heavy hitter, concentrating fire, mostly for big bosses. It should be noted that this also had a weird flashing frequency that just gave me headaches. So I'm not going to be using any footage of that, but, you know, if you think this game looks interesting, a bit of a photosensitivity warning in advance. You also have a homing shot, which I felt to be probably the most useful of all attacks in this game. The biggest issue being that it is a bit slow to reload, so if you're fighting multiple enemies very, very quickly, you might miss out on some things and you might not be able to properly defend yourself. You also have a reverse firing shot, and while I understand and can see the validity of these types of weapons, I've never been able to use them terribly well in any game ever. In this game, it also has the most obnoxious sound effects ever, so that's a thing too. Each of these weapons has a very important situational value to it, so it's important to know when the best time to use each of these weapons is, and utilize them accordingly. Unfortunately, some of the game design seems like it almost incentivizes you not to do that too, which is certainly a choice, but not a terribly good one. But this is where things kind of go south, because this game is incredibly player hostile, and it starts all with that leveling system. While the leveling system does keep you alive with its health refills and its better weapons, it's the only way to, help keep you alive in this very hostile environment. If you take any amount of damage whatsoever, whatever weapon you have equipped at the time will de-level to a minimum of level 1. You can't, like, go to level 0 and lose the weapon entirely, which is a small mercy. This game doesn't give you many of those. And what I found was this was de-incentivizing me to actually use my best weapons, the weapons I'm best with, or even the ones that were most suited for the situation, just for fear of losing them. Because you only de-level the weapon you have equipped, so the strategy I kind of ended up employing was to use almost like the least effective weapon for this situation, just so if I lose something, it's not that bad. When in reality, I think the game's design was probably trying to force me to use the best weapon because each weapon is very situational. But it's that fear of losing something that's actually very, very powerful that ultimately made me not want to use my weapons at all, really. I was just so scared of losing the weapons I'd built up the entire time. And if you have to restart the game, forget about it, because you're starting with level 1 weapons, and that's basically a death sentence from the word go. But let's talk about that a little bit, because, you know, if you lose all that health, you lose a life. I feel like I don't need to explain that, that's how video games work. What isn't immediately apparent in this game, at least from the outset, is there isn't really a life system. If you lose all your health, you game over. Boots you back to the title screen, and then you can continue. Except that there's no in-game checkpoints, and like I said, you start with level 1 weapons, so good luck getting back there. So you might die a few more times, you know, a few more game overs, whatever, you can continue, right? Well, no, because the game only gives you a certain limited number of continues, and they don't tell you that anywhere. So not only are you put in a worse situation when you die, having lost all your weapons, but you could potentially just get booted all the way back to the start, just for 1 or 2 very simple mistakes. Because of this, I think that this game is not a terribly easy to approach or easy to get into game for beginners. Even though the game isn't inherently super difficult, I've played much more complicated, difficult, and like just completely hostile shmups that were honestly a lot more friendly than this to players. The fact that this game decides to not only kill you, but remove all your weapons, start you back before you died, and then basically take away any chance of continuing because they only have limited numbers of them, it's really hard to recommend. Otherwise, this game is pretty standard for a shmup. There really isn't that much going on under the hood. It's a vertical scrolling shmup. The enemies don't ever get really terribly complex, and it doesn't get ever like bullet hell Danmaku either. It's otherwise a fairly approachable game with a rather simple difficulty, if it weren't for the fact that the game likes to immediately punch you into the ground once you start taking any amount of damage, because oh, you lost your weapon, oh, you lost your life, oh, you lost your progress, oh, you lost your continues, better start again, if that appeals to you. I don't know, I feel like this could have been better refined, give some form of level checkpoints, maybe give a couple of lives per continue, or at the very least, you know, the game saves what level you're on. Why not save your progress in terms of the levels of your weapons when you entered that? Because at least at that point you have a fighting chance. Basically, the moment you make any mistake in this game, it snowballs really bad, and that could be incredibly frustrating. Otherwise though, Imperium is a pretty standard shmup. It doesn't really do anything too interesting, and to be fair, it's not the most difficult. Any individual encounter with enemy patterns in a set vacuum isn't really that big of a deal. And if it weren't for how punishing this game really does get, it would be pretty approachable by basically anyone. I almost got vibes of very early Zero Ranger just from the frequency of enemies. It starts out very tame and could be pretty approachable if it weren't for the fact that it would then proceed to kick you into the dirt just by making a simple mistake. Because of that, I'm not sure this game is easily recommendable for beginners just because of how bad your mistakes do get punished. And even for experts, if you're prone to frustration, this game will probably do that to you. At least I found that to be the case. Overall, the presentation to Kidou Soukou Dion, Mobile Armored Dion, is honestly flat out its most impressive trait. While the sprite work for the individual enemies are pretty nondescript, the larger bosses and the sprite work outside of it is thoroughly impressive. And I quite like the fact that your mech has several animations, swinging left, swinging right, pulling forward and back. While you don't see much of your mech aside from its backside, you still get to see its legs sort of swing around a little bit, and it's just a nice little detail that makes it look a lot better, and it makes it feel a little bit more like there's a living creature in this thing. Like, you know, it is ostensibly supposed to be a suit of armor being worn by someone, so having that little detail definitely sells it a little bit more. There's also just in general some really cool visual set pieces. This game's got great visual flair, just in general. The opening cutscene, the actual like mech designs and the lighting on it, very, very impressive. The environmental designs are also very, very nice. Once again, there is a bit of a difference between the North American Imperium and the Japanese Mobile Armored Dion. I think the Japanese version just looks infinitely better and more detailed and just, you know, a more visually engaging game. And I think part of that might just be because it was given a little bit extra development time. I think this game was originally released in November 1992 in North America and a month later in December for Japan. I'm guessing in that time they worked in some reworked backgrounds, and I think they actually used a layering effect in some of the backgrounds as well, utilizing the multiple layers of the Super Nintendo, making it just look a lot more polished and better. The soundtrack to this game is excellent, but it was also composed by Tenpei Sato, so that seems kind of obvious. Without this game, there would be no Speed Queen, Rockin' Rocks, and R&R Junkie. So what this game is basically saying is, Disgaea fans, you're welcome. The soundtrack itself almost sounds kind of like a sort of knockoff Mega Man X, and I don't mean that disparagingly. It just has that same hard-rocking, hard-hitting jam that you get from one of those Super Nintendo Mega Man X games. It just sounds really, really good. The sound effects as well are really, really quite lovely. I want to draw special attention to the enemy exploding sound effect because it's just so powerful and crunchy. And I was honestly surprised the Super Nintendo could put out a sound kind of like this. I played the Super Nintendo port of the Genesis Thunder Force 3 and was thoroughly disappointed by how it tried to handle the Genesis sounds on the Super Nintendo. But this sounds almost like it's trying to completely go for that sort of Genesis crunching sort of sound from the harsher sound chip. It works really, really well in just that one sound effect. And I can't stress enough how good a decent soundscape can make your actions more impactful. By having a more impactful sound, it just empowers you. It makes you feel like, yeah, that sounded like expensive damage that the enemy is going to have to spend lots and lots of money to repair. It's a good feeling. Seriously, the sound effects in this game are legit. Now, if you want a copy of Super Famicom Mobile Armored Dion, Kidou Soukou Dion, cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now is about $70. And the cheapest Imperium that I can see is almost $200. That is insane for this game. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to the patron saint of cool mecha things, Jet Wolf, for sending me this. I have to admit, I would not have looked too terribly closely into Imperium myself. The fact is, this game, while it's not inherently a bad game, it's overly punishing for the smallest mistakes. I think it would be a great way to get into the genre if it weren't for that punishment. Aside from that, while the leveling system is kind of neat, I think this game is largely unspectacular, is probably the best word for me to use. I don't think this game is going to try and challenge the thrones of your Space Mega Forces or your Axleys anytime soon. It has a couple really neat features, but I think the most remarkable thing about it is just the region differences more than anything, because the game itself is pretty tame. It's fine. It's not particularly doing anything wrong, but it's also not doing anything particularly stand out either. I think that this game is decent, but there are many, many better shmups out there for the price. I mean, hell, I could basically go out and buy another cave shmup, and those are some of the most fun ever. Hell, for the cost of one copy of Mobile Armored Dion, you could get like 6 copies of Zero Ranger and have some money left over to buy something else on Steam. And I mean, Zero Ranger is one of the most approachable shmups I've ever seen. And it almost feels like it has shades of this very early on, in the sense that it's a pretty approachable shmup, except that game is constantly rewarding you every step of the way, even for your failures, to encourage you to keep trying to press forward and get a little better, whereas this game is constantly trying to tear you down. And I think that's the big difference in design mentalities here. I think that constantly punishing your players is certainly one way you could go about doing things, but it's not necessarily the best way, especially if we're trying to get away from the whole arcade mentality that getting rid of the scores and sort of implementing an experience system would kind of do. Or if you're simply trying to attract other people to the genre. You know, it feels like we're trying to get away from the arcades, but we're doubling down on the punishment. And honestly, design-wise, this game would have benefited by going hard the other direction, focusing more and more on encouraging players to continue playing it, maybe by giving multiple routes, or just not instantly basically snowballing a death sentence the moment you make one mistake, is all I'm saying. At the end of the day, Imperium is not a bad shmup, and it does some interesting stuff, but it's too punishing and too expensive for me to readily recommend.